entrare un... So, okay. So hello, good morning everyone. Thank you very much, actually good afternoon, it is afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us here today for this conversation. As you can see, we have a slight change of program in the sense that events beyond our control ensured that our two main speakers were not able to join us. So they're with us virtually, but not in person. And it all happened too late for us to make any adjustments to the event, but we felt that, given that we also have some lunch prepared for you, it would be a nice opportunity to meet up again. So thank you very much for joining us today. I'm going to take up just a few minutes because I'd like to give you a little bit of background on the project, and B, I would like to acknowledge the support towards this project by the Open Society European Policy Institute, in particular one of the co-authors, Marta Martinelli, with whom well, we were partners in crime. And the other, of course, was Lisa Bomassi, who's here, who is my deputy at Carnegie Europe. I would also like to thank the authors of the single chapters. They are scattered around the world. Some of them might be connected virtually. And it's really been quite a large endeavour. We were working in 12 hours time zones, so you can imagine the meetings were quite a challenge to put together. I would also like to thank my colleagues at Carnegie Europe who've put together this event against all odds, because most of the things that could have gone wrong did. So, so this is my sort of disclaimer. But then I'd also like to share with you a few words about the logic behind this project. I mean, the first and pretty obvious point is that global engagement is an inescapable fact. A decade ago, we used to have conversations about whether the EU should be a regional power or a global power. That's just not a dilemma any longer, or at least hasn't been until recently. Let's see if the war in Ukraine will change things. But despite the fact that it's inescapable, there is actually a gap in Europe's understanding of the rest of the world. This is a political gap, and we see that play out at every summit, be it EU-Africa summit or Indo-Pacific meetings, but it's also a gap in the literature. There is a healthy and very interesting body of literature investigating public perceptions in a number of countries, but they tend to be the large countries, China, the US, South Africa looking south, and there's very little on other countries. So we decided to choose countries that had been undercovered in the literature. Secondly, sorry, I see, is it, okay. Secondly, there is a gap in perceptions and mutual understandings that need to be better explored so that the EU can finesse its diplomacy. But in terms of findings, it really is a mosaic. And it's very hard to summarize this. For this reason, I actually do recommend that you take a look at this, download it if you want to, and highlight the points of interest in the 7 countries that we're looking at in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. But so then, rather than summarize, I will just try to bring out a few takeaways, not even the main takeaways, that for me resonate, that have sort of accompanied me through this journey on this project. And the first point is the primacy of geopolitics. It is clear that it's not just about geopolitical dynamics playing out in these countries, but it's also about how events are narrated in these countries. And that it leaves very little space for other approaches to international relations, which I think are pertinent in Europe, but also in the rest of the world. So, for instance, think of people power. There's no space for that in the way in which international politics are being told in the countries that we covered elsewhere. The second takeaway that came out is that, I mean, obviously, we asked our researchers to reach out not just to the usual suspects, but to go a bit beyond, to reach out to people living in other cities or in the countryside, or to government and opposition. It depended a little bit on the national context, which groups they targeted, but they went beyond the usual suspects. And it's very clear that the more the individuals contacted and interviewed knew the EU, the better, the more they were in contact with the EU, the better they knew it, but also the more they appreciated all the various global standards and values that the EU stands for. And therefore, if you look at, for instance, civil society that has received EU support, or the business sector that has been engaged with the EU, you have much more benign views of the European Union, but also much more disappointment when the EU does not follow through with the claims that it makes in its foreign policy. Conversely, it's interesting to see that very often a lot of the accusations of double standards, of insincerity, etc., they too come from groups that are playing geopolitical games, and they're using them, manipulating these ideas for their, be it domestic consent, be it hedging in international politics. So the dynamics are really quite complex, and I think they pose challenges for the way in which the EU engages with countries around the world, which are broader sometimes than we think. So these would be my main takeaways. Now I'd like to move on to introducing our speakers. So we have online two members of the project. Funmi Olonisakin, who is Vice President of International Engagement and Service at King's College London. She's also a Professor of Security Leadership and Development at the African Leadership Centre, again in the School of Global Studies at King's College London. And Oliver Stuenkel, who is an Associate Professor at the School of International Relations at the Fundação Getúlio Vargas in São Paulo, Brazil. He's also a non-resident scholar affiliated with Carnegie. So we're very glad to have them, and Oliver, who wasn't able to travel in the end, it's very early in Brazil, so thank you very much for your early start of the day. And then following some first remarks from members of the group, Stephen Everts, who is a Senior Advisor on Strategy and Communication at the European External Action Service, has kindly agreed to offer some responses, some comments to the report and to what our speakers will contribute to us. So let me start with the first set of questions. I'm going to tie it a little bit to current affairs. We've had recently the... can I ask, are they connected? Because we're not seeing our speakers. Yes, okay, fine. Yes. So we've recently, there have been quite a few events that have taken place in what we call under the label of the Global South. The first was, of course, the G20 in Indonesia, and then COP26 in Egypt. And I think in both cases we've seen an alliance of countries coming from that geography, pushing for certain positions. In particular, I'm thinking of the loss and damage fund at COP26, which was quite controversial. But in the end, the EU decided to back this proposal coming from the G77 group. So I'd like to ask Funmi in particular, because you work so much on leadership, what kind of leadership are we seeing coming from the Global South? Funmi, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so very much. And let me say, how much I regret not being there in person. I was fully prepared and hoping to be with you there in person today. But it's interesting that you ask about the kind of leadership, because for a change, I think we're beginning to see, if you like, the bubbling up of what you said is, earlier, as something that is normally missing from the dialogue, the people power. But the people power manifesting itself in the form of expert power. Because if you see, for example, take the African continent, that the negotiators on the African continent were the experts who used science to back up the claim that there had to be a common position in Africa, and that common position was founded on a number of, the narrative is very strong, but if you look at the most common narrative, for example, and let me just highlight two of them. One, in terms of the investment in conversion, in that transition, that we all know that the investment that goes to Africa is something between 2 to 3%, if we're talking about investment in, the new clean energy. But directly tied to that also is that the continent is being asked to make a major sacrifice. It's true that it survives on fossil fuel, cooks with coal, all of that we see, but actually has contributed, if you like, less than 3% to, to the global, usage, to the crisis that we see at the moment. And so that imbalance, finally, we're seeing a region like that deploy evidence in making a strong argument. And in COP27 in Egypt, some of us didn't even think it was realizable that you would have this loss and damage fund. That if Africa actually is to move from its current dependence on fossil fuel, for example, and convert to green energy, it would need those countries that have created much of the damage to contribute to a fund that helps the continent do that. Even so, there's an argument lurking in the background around, the idea that if African countries are to really join the rest of the world, the rich countries in development, then it will be difficult to rely on green energy alone to industrialize. So the question around industrialization is again part of what creates a notion of north-south divide, even though there's greater complexity in it. But the leadership lesson, to close my input on that, is that of mutuality. So instead of focusing on individual leaders most of the time, we're beginning to see blocks of nations building mutuality together, because I tell you, without the EU backing of that proposal, we would really not have seen any movement. It doesn't tell us what will happen to that fund, whether there will be resources in it, but to see an EU and an African Union, and we've seen the EU strategy evolve in the last few decades. But this time around, we're beginning to see some concrete action around it. And it might actually, in the end, it's early days yet, change the perception of Europe as a bloc in Africa if this, if this shifts the dial in one way or the other. The very existence of the fund itself really tells us that the narrative is changing, even though overall, I don't think COP27 could count as a significant, success and move towards what we want to see globally.
I'd like to throw the same question to Latin America. We have a new set of leaders. Some of it is generational change, some of it is political change. How does it look from Latin America, Oliver?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. I'd love to be there in person. Hope to be able to join in the future in person on the next occasion. I think that the political change in Brazil has led to, of course, a desire by the country to re-engage in a lot of issues where it has been absent over the past 4 years. Has been basically a pariah when it comes to the global debate around climate change, and has quite symbolically had 2 delegations at the COP in Egypt, a very small delegation by the current government, which had a largely no role to play, and a massive presence of the incoming government, which, by the way, was also somewhat criticized because we had, we had hundreds of of civil society members flying all the way from Brazil to Egypt. But I think in that sense, there is an attempt to signal re-engagement and also the desire to assume international responsibility, even though I think that's a two-way street in a way that there's also expectation that Europe, the United States will step up and really support countries like Brazil, but also other countries around that are part of the Amazon. And I think that there's a tremendous window of opportunity to re-engage Latin America after years of incredible difficulties, the region that has suffered most during the pandemic. It's the region that grows at the lowest rates in the world, will continue to have a lot of anti-incumbency sentiment and political instability, which makes this a completely different moment from the 2000s, when we've had also a broad political change, but which was accompanied by stability, whereas now I expect basically all leaders in Latin America to be quite unpopular over the coming years as well, which makes them less effective global actors, because unless you have a modicum of internal stability, that will, I think, make it difficult to engage internationally. And when it comes to the G20, I think that there is also room for cooperation, particularly on broad geopolitical issues, but also important to point out that when it comes to things like the war in Ukraine, despite the massive differences between the outgoing government in Brazil and the incoming government, really not that much difference when it comes to how, for example, Brazil or most Latin American countries view the current conflict. In Europe, which has also already led to some disappointment when the president-elect made a series of controversial statements about Zelensky's supposed partial responsibility for the war. So I think you have lots of opportunity now to re-engage, strengthen ties between Europe and Latin America, but also important to keep in mind that it will continue to be divergences, particularly on very broad geopolitical issues involving Russia, Ukraine, and also China.
Thank you for that. Which, I mean, I think we could say on climate, there's a new space and opportunity for shared leadership. There is a need to back this with financial and economic investments, both for Africa and also for Latin America. I mean, there's talk of a lost generation in Latin America. But thank you also for highlighting the differences on geopolitics and security, because I did want to move on to talking about this. In the report, there are quite mixed assessments of the EU from, for instance, Venezuela, where it's highly mixed and polarized, Ethiopia, where there's huge disappointment and opening about the EU and an opening towards China, whereas in the Philippines, the EU support of the Mindanao process is generally seen quite positively. And how do you think, from your perspectives of your regions and the countries that you know best, and Funmi, you have an academic background in peace, conflict, and security. Where is how do you think is the EU's role is seen here, and what could be done, what could be explored more?
I mean, this is an area that, thank you for that. I think the EU's role is very interesting, and there are three ways in which I can see the perspectives on the EU. When it comes to geopolitics, it's not very often that you see a clear-cut position in Africa, but you can actually see what's going on in Ukraine and see how the EU has not been able to really impact the continent that much because the larger, geopolitical issues that EU countries themselves, you can see clearly where they stand. And you can take a country like South Africa and see the debate that went on in South Africa over South Africa's position. on Ukraine, but actually in a continent where out of 54 countries, about 31 or 30 countries abstained on this issue when it got to a vote in the General Assembly. So there's complexity around that. And there's a sense in which we see a return to the old war politics. By that, I mean the bipolar rivalry, even though this is now really a new kind of East-West competition. And to see this abstention, you're beginning to see the kind of what some people say might be a return to the idea of non-alignment, which, if you look at the G77 group of countries and what they stood for before. But I dare say that this moment is different, though, because the EU continues to thrive in some sense in Africa, especially around some other kinds of questions. One is Ethiopia. And I think Ethiopia, for example, is where African countries themselves have at times been dragged screaming, if you like, at the UN Security Council. But it's also the place where the EU has played particular roles when US position was not always very clear. Biden's arrival began to change that. So it depends on the issue. It depends on, where people sit. But the tendency also is that, and we see this, that various European countries are then outspoken so that their character in the EU is sometimes different from their character outside, in the bilateral engagement. And we're going to see the reaction to, if you like, Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa, because I think the Ethiopian crisis really, really is about the nature of the state, the kind of state that will emerge, whether that, the multinational kind of state, the multinational kind of federation, or a centralized, or I dare say even over centralized state that emerges in the Horn of Africa. So those things themselves, this is a difficult issue that threatens, if you like, the worldview of the European Union in particular ways. And I think the European Union is going to get to a point where it might be the only trusted arbiter in this space. And in that sense, even in the case of Ukraine, I think the EU is underperforming in the way that it's reflecting on these issues in Africa. Oliver spoke about the difference, and this is my last point, between the previous regime and the new, the incoming regime in Brazil, the incoming government in Brazil. And I think the tensions around Ukraine speak to some difficult geopolitical times for us, because the very ideas that underpin the creation, if you like, of the United Nations, the idea that we will no longer have a war of aggression and that will be resisted at all costs, that norm has been broken. Before now, the norm of, that never again would we see the kinds of crimes against humanity that we saw in the Second World War. That norm has also been violated. But to not stand up to the defense of this norm in a way that we have an effective arbiter, becomes really challenging. China looks to be playing a particular game. The US, the tension between the US and Russia, or you can even say between the West and Russia, is so strong. But what is the thing that the EU has to be an arbiter around? It's about two things at the center of that conflict that no one ever mentions, which is where Brazil is trying to play a game, play a role, which is where you begin to see the arguments of some of the African countries, is to say, are there legitimate issues around the borders between NATO and whatever was on the other side before, and Russia, what is now Russia? Was there some kind of notion that NATO would not spread beyond a particular zone? Who's mediating that is no longer the United Nations. But the second important thing is, doesn't Ukraine have a right to determine its membership of a bloc, the European Union? Those are two different issues, and it should rest in different places. And I think the EU, might be perceived in the end to be playing a game of sitting on a particular side of the fence instead of being that kind of arbiter. This is my read of what is emerging in a region like Africa. Thanks.
Very much, Funmi, and I'd like to bring Oliver in as well at this point. On the similar question of peace and security, Europe's role, is the war in Ukraine a Western war, or is it a global war?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that I think the experience of Brazil the past 4 years show us something very interesting, which is that nationalist populism, even outside of Europe or outside of the North Atlantic, will tend to be always anti-EU, and that's really quite interesting because Bolsonaro has been anti-China and anti-globalist when he ran as a candidate. But in the end, because Western pressure on issues like human rights and the environment was so profound, the anti-China sentiment fell by the wayside, despite profound crises between Bolsonaro and China. In the end, I think China would have been the main beneficiary of a Bolsonaro re-election, because what really remained in the end was profound anti-globalism, anti-multilateralism, and a really unsurmountable crisis between Brazil, the on one side, and the United States, and Europe on the other. So this idea that Europe was sort of this globalist dream, I think, shows us that the European Union will have to contend whenever nationalist populists emerge, in Latin America at least, that this brand of Bolsonarismo will always be anti-Europe because they're against sort of any type of supranationalist structures. And I think that will continue to be an issue now, also because Bolsonarism is not dead. It will continue to stick around. And that, I think, will be a geopolitical concern for the European Union in the medium and long term. The second issue is that when it comes to Brazil's view, and then in that particular case, there's really no difference between, or no profound difference between Lula, Bolsonaro, or previous Brazilian presidents, is that there is a consensus in Brazil that multi-polar order is beneficial to Brazil, which is kind of counterintuitive, because IR theory would say that, in a stable unipolar world, it's easier for a country that's large but fairly vulnerable, without any hard power, to manage its relationships to other actors. Brazil's issue, of course, with unipolarity is that it's very close to the unipole, to the hegemonic power, and that creates a consensus, irrespective of ideology, that having solid relations to other great powers is important for Brazil and other Latin American countries to manage its relationship to the United States. And that explains why, when Russia invaded Ukraine, that, of course, was sort of being lamented behind closed doors. But in the end, there was never a question that Brazil would not actively seek to isolate Russia, because what really mattered was preserving ties to other great powers to manage the relationship to Washington, and not what Brazil in particular was thinking about the abuse of human rights or war crimes being committed in Ukraine. And I think that has led to some disappointment, of course, in the West, that will make it extremely difficult, I think, for Western actors to sort of create this broad coalition that goes beyond the North Atlantic to actually pressuring Russia. Just the news trade data came out yesterday, and Brazil's trade to Russia skyrocketed since the invasion of Ukraine, because just like after the invasion of Crimea, Brazilian products are substituting a series of European products on the shelves of Russian supermarkets. So that's an issue to be taken into account. And again, I think there's very little space to push Latin America. And that goes beyond Brazil's dependence, or Latin American dependence, on Russian fertilizers. That's actually also, it's really a profound geopolitical issue. And the same, I think, will apply if there were to be some kind of tension in Taiwan. Latin America will not join sort of a coalition of Western countries condemning China And we've seen that play out in the 5G dynamic, where all US attempts and Trump's attempts to convince Bolsonaro to ban Huawei failed because the ideological commitment and Bolsonaro's desire to be close to Trump was not as strong as this profound consensus in Brazil that all doors must be kept open, and the only way to defend Brazil's interests is to maintain ties to all major powers. But that's also an opportunity for the European Union, because that view, Brazil's view that it must establish and preserve ties to other great powers, includes the EU as one of the actors which Brazil would like to use to manage relationships to Washington. And there was a meeting that Germany's former foreign minister organized in Berlin in 2019, inviting all foreign ministers. At the time, Brazil's foreign minister couldn't make it, which produced this immense relief among everybody involved, basically, because he was so anti-EU. And there was I spoke to several foreign ministers from Latin America at the time, and there was really a sense that the EU and Latin America were kind of thinking about these things in the same way. We want to reject this Cold War pressure. We don't want to take sides. We want to maintain our strategic autonomy, and Europe will be a partner in that. I think that dynamic still exists, but the Ukraine war has made things a bit more difficult, because now, from a Brazilian or Latin American point of view, Europe has, of course, moved closer to the United States and away from Russia, also a bit from China. There's an interesting perception of how there's a growing amount of debates in Europe about questioning the dependence on China. So I would say that that has limited a bit the space for cooperation on the geopolitical side, but it remains, I think, valid that both Latin America and Europe are reluctant to embark on this new Cold War dynamic. They don't want to be having to choose sides. They somewhat want to be in the middle in this situation of growing tensions between Washington and Beijing. And in that sense, I think there continues to be a tremendous amount of room for deepening ties. And I think the trade deal between the EU and Mercosur is just one part of that. Greater cooperation on climate change is another, and cooperation on human rights and numerous other issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oliver. I'd like to bring in Stephen Everts, but before that, can I just say that we'll move to questions and comments, and those who are with us online can write their questions in the chat function on YouTube, and they will be relayed to me on my phone. So please do not hesitate. Stephen, you've heard a lot. Yeah. I think you should pick and choose what you how you want to respond. But you work at the heart of foreign policy. So how does this resonate for you? What types of questions does it raises?
Well, thanks a lot, Rosa, for undertaking this project, which I think is really fantastic. I like the premise. I like the overall shape that the project has taken, and also the conversation that we're having today, because it's good to do a reality check in life, to ask this question: how do others see us? I like very much the sort of the unpacking that you've done and your colleagues have done, and that we've heard also in the discussion so far of macro questions, but what you bring to it is a spirit of granularity. It's complex, you say. It depends on the issue. It depends on the political context. It depends on so many other things. As EU, we're constantly judged, and that's right and proper. That's democratic politics. We're judged against rhetoric and expectations, and sometimes there's a gap between these two. But your life, you're also judged against alternatives, right? And we heard some of it a bit as well. Sometimes people are critical about the EU, and that's understandable. But then you also have to say, but yes, but would another partner, a big power, would they really be a better partner on topic X, Y, or Z? And so, I mean, I think it's a great project, and we have a lot to go through. Since climate and security figure prominently thus far, let me just respond a bit more on those. I mean, on climate, I think we saw indeed in Sharm el-Sheikh that the European Union moved. And you and colleagues also pointed out to this loss and damage, which became central to this discussion. I think it's clear that this was not a European ask. It was something that was not immediately at the wish list of European negotiators, but because this commitment that I think is sincere to the overall multilateral process on accelerating the green transition and doing this in the global context, and the notion that we had to deliver on the climate justice aspect of this was felt. So Europe moved, and I think that was also recognized by Funmi and others, and I think that's gratifying, because politically we need to also defend these new steps by Europe on climate finance domestically as well. So I think that's a very positive point, and concept we heard about seeking mutualities of opportunities, two-way streets. I think that those are very good phrases around which one can build positive agendas. Ambitious, and by all means people can be critical too of EU positions, but let's try to work on that. What we hear also from Oliver and from Funmi is the notion of people expecting more from Europe, but also don't leave us alone. That's incidentally also a sentiment one hears if you go to parts of the world that are not yet in our conversation. I'm thinking of the Indo-Pacific or Central Asia. If you travel there, people say, don't leave us alone. Europe, you gotta be there as an alternative, as an option, as an active player, and I think that's understandable. Oliver spoke about leaving all doors open. Again, that's a sentiment one hears in many places around the world, and that's understandable. We live in a more transactional world overall. It's multipolar. We would like it to be still more multilateral than it is multipolar. But at the same time, we recognize the world as it is, while we try to push it in a more multilateral direction. Last comment just on Ukraine, and I'm glad, Rosa, you put that question, because I think it goes to the heart of a lot of what we're discussing. I think there is a battle of narratives around the world. I think genuinely that this should not be seen as a European war only. We cannot normalize aggression. It was also said, the fundamental norm of the non-use of force enshrined in the UN Charter has been broken blatantly, and that's not just a European problem. That's a problem for everybody. We're all more insecure in a world where it becomes okay to invade your neighbor. So I was actually gratified that on the third of the UNGA votes that we're all discussing, everybody remembers the one at the beginning of the year, but there were also votes in September on the annexation, and there again 140 countries plus voted to reject the annexation, which is illegal, unacceptable. So we should be constantly working on that, not be complacent, engage more, and that's clear, but also not prematurely concede the notion that Europe is losing ground everywhere and that there is a problem with this war against Ukraine, that people are, no, I think 140 plus countries voted against the annexation, and let's work in that direction. Let's hear more.
Yes, thank you very much, Stephen. I'd like to bring in questions, comments from the audience. We have a microphone. If anyone would like to, there it is. Would anyone like to break the ice? You have an opportunity to ask questions. Please, ask questions or comments. So in the front row, and those online, yes, can also write their questions in.
Well, thank you very much. It's a horrible sound. Can you all hear me well? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Now, thank you very much for all the presentations and congratulations on this important project. A few reflections. So my name is Sam van der Staak. I'm the head of the Euro Program of International IDEA. We work a lot with civil society organizations in Latin America, Africa, Asia. And what we get from those discussions is a few things. One is terminology matters. So Global South is one that is currently being challenged, right? And that's in the title of the report. I think even EAS is considering what's the alternative to Global South, because it can be considered as a Eurocentric term, right? It's a center versus periphery term. And you see that other global players like the US are doing away with the term. You know, how do we deal with terminology? And when we talk about narrative, it is about terminology and saying the right things. Two, is narrative versus action, right? So we talk a lot about how should we change our narrative, but of course our global partners aren't stupid. If we just repackage the same message, they will know. So I think that comes down to how do we, as EU, change our action in a way that we give and take, that we become a geopolitical player as the EU wants to be. And I think that's what happened in the UN vote that you refer to. The EU went in thinking that as long as we just present this as a values thing, then the rest of the world will unite behind us. I think the US played it more as a political player and said, if you support us, this is what you get in return, and that's what the EU traditionally does less of. Thirdly, the EU is, of course, a huge donor. It's a huge donor, but global South partners, if we have to use that term, are often unaware. Right? They see the China model or the Russia model as competing with the EU model, but actually if you go for the data, you see that the EU is a much bigger donor, has been there for many, many decades, has much more to offer, but global South partners often don't know. Right? So how can the EU celebrate and sell the good things it does in a better way so that our partners know that it's not just values that we're there for, but that we are actually the ones helping. And I think this comes down to a problem that the EU has in that it's 27 countries, right? So what you often see is that the EU gives a lot, but then Mr. Macron or Mr. Schulz walk away with the credits because those are seen as the political leaders, right? So how does the EU claim that political leadership? I think there we have a challenge, and that's a matter of speaking with one voice. And then lastly, the EU can probably present itself more as a peer to its global partners. It's often seen as the one that comes in and teaches. It's seen as the colonizer, the previous colonizer. And I think that's a fallacy. That's something that doesn't necessarily have to be seen that way. The EU, half of the EU members were colonized themselves, right? So I think there's a lot to say that the EU is facing similar problems as the one that is trying to help, including on its internal democracies, right? So if we want to say that you have to support our values abroad, we can also be open and say that we are having democracy problems at home with Hungary and Poland and present ourselves as the equal instead of the one that comes in and teaches. So some reflections, thanks.
Thank you very much. Here, Jackie.
Thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for this project. It's really needed at the moment. Also working with civil society in 4 different continents, and the debates we had, all of us aligned on issues in principle on protection of civilians, on human rights. The debates we had with our partners on Ukraine have been very visceral. 3 very quick reflections. The point you made, Stephen, about justice, I think is central to this. So much of the arguments and the perceptions and the speaking across each other is to do with historical grievances and perceptions of past injustice, many of which are very legitimate. The issue, though, that we need to be much stronger on is the response to current injustices, so that we don't get distracted into what's been called whataboutism, that we're more concerned about the actions of Blackwater on the African continent than the actions of Wagner on the African continent, because, you know, we need to be concerned with what's happening at present, but also the future. So the climate justice work at the COP was really an important step. A question I would have to Funmi is, what does future justice look like to African leaders across different policy areas? And that leads me to my second point, which is about the limits of foreign policy in stricto sensu here, because it's really important to look at the whole gamut of the posture. You know, if we're denying IPR on health to the same countries that we then want to buy gas from when there's a crisis, then we're not presenting I'm talking now as the European Union, which I'm not, but you know, the European Union is not presenting a consistent position. And likewise, and this is my third point, the issue around consistency of application of norms. Perceptions matter, but I wonder if there's a bit too much effort being spent on trying to control or manipulate perceptions in all sorts of directions by all sorts of actors, which is something that's ultimately, if you have grievances, if you have historical positions and identities, really hard to depart from. What you can control are your actions. And here, this issue of hypocrisy, of double standards, is real. The fact that there are concerns about authoritarianism in Russia linked to the refusal, as well as the war, linked to the refusal to buy gas and oil. However, at the same time, European actors going to Saudi Arabia and others to buy oil and gas is a pretty obvious one, but there are others. So this real issue around consistency of application of standards is crucial to us all, it's crucial to blocs, and it's increasingly crucial to the UN, which we haven't really spoken about here, and which it'd be great to hear a little bit more from the panel on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jackie. I'd like to bring in Funmi and Oliver to answer some direct questions, but also maybe make some comments on the basis of what has been said so far.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Let me first say that these are a set of excellent comments and questions. And I think they're so insightful that I think we can actually begin to raise questions for the project, for a follow-up project. Because I truly believe that we're in a moment of transition in the world where we need to really seriously go back and re-challenge terminology, norms, application of norms, and actually have an honest conversation together about what actually is the lowest common denominator amongst us globally. And so very quickly on the question of terminology, I love that. You know, Sam, we, in the end, you know, we can say what's in a name, right? But that name matters, especially when there isn't consistency in what we mean when we say something. And it's true that the notion of global south changing rapidly. We can't even really say sufficiently that, you know, it won't be true if we just said it was rich nations versus poor nations. We know it's not a matter of geography. We no longer can say that, because to constantly then refer sometimes, as we do, that is changing to a country like China as part of that global south. If you're talking about, you know, developing world, rich versus poor, would not be true anymore. I think China needs to take its place on the global stage as a rich country and as a very powerful country, not one that is really, you know, in the same category as the so-called global south. So I take the point. Is it center periphery? That could probably work, but the terminology that people have also used the most in recent times by people from you know different parts of the so-called global south is the idea of people in the majority world. And so if we're talking about majority world and try to define, conceptualize that, ideally, we might be getting somewhere. But things are in flux is the point I'm trying to make. And it is right to really challenge this terminology, but we need to carefully replace it with something. Now, the narrative and action point, I take the point. Narrative without action, it's become so hollow. But I think this is where the EU, and we single out the EU in this way, and I think the project has done that, rightly so as well, because when you see a bloc that behaves a particular way, that has a particular kind of character, it doesn't fall in global south, or it doesn't even fall in, you know, neat categories in that way, but it does something in terms of how it intervenes in the global space or in regional spaces. Then we need to ask, what is the EU identity that it wants to convey? And I mentioned in my earlier intervention, my earlier statement, that you see certain countries in the EU go very robustly to have bilateral agreements that sometimes might even contravene what the collective in the EU would want. But certain members of the EU, as has been well said, in terms of how the EU is seen, they look different from what the EU says they are, from what the EU says it is. When the UK was in the EU, that was one of such countries. And so you see, a former colonizer that behaves in a particular way, that defends its sphere of interest. The same can be said of France. And Germany as an economic powerhouse is different from these two. And therefore, the EU needs to take the bull by the horn. I like an emerging narrative that says we stand for this set of values and so on. So much so that the more powerful members of that union have to be able to say, we will behave in this particular way all the time. That's a consistency around these sets of issues. We are a different kind of nation in this area. And we need to find a way to get that identity that the EU is confident about, because quite honestly, and I agree with the point, the identity of its leading nations, some of its more powerful nations, sometimes tends to infect the overall EU identity. Jackie's points, I think your points are spot on. You have a question to me. This question of historical injustices or grievances, that is very important. That is actually the turning point when now I retreat to Africa, where the continent of Africa is concerned. We saw what happened with Libya. That was a painful experience for many African countries. But I dare say that not seeing, being blind to the way the African continent at the moment itself is configured, in which what the people want on the continent can be so sharply different from what its leaders do. And part of the double standard is sometimes Europe then really acts in concert with those leaders without recognizing that the result of their actions will do harm to the people. I think it's important that as we now look for to either we reinforce those norms that have been so viciously violated, including the one in Ukraine, either we reinforce that or we create new norms that we're going to be able to abide by. And what does future justice look like to me is that, number one, we ought to no longer, it's not effective to do that, make a statement that we're supporting the world in one area, but actually we're also raping that part of the world in another area. Europe, and I use this as an example in the previous lecture that I gave, and actually the West does not separate its security from its economics most of the time. They find a way. The West does not do that. The Europe might become an economic powerhouse, but it's part of a tight Western, ideological politics, saying this is democracy and democratic development. It's also part, unspoken part of an ideological economics, which affects certain parts of the world more than others. In Africa, that ideological economics looks like the supplying of raw materials. So if you make cocoa or you have rubber, you supply it, it is converted in another country that has industry, it's brought back to the continent at a much higher price. So they're doomed to a life of poverty for many of their citizens in a global environment like this. Africa negotiates badly for itself, and that's its own fault. But let's also understand, therefore, that if we're going to deal with future justice, so it's ideological politics, which is what governed the First Cold War. It is ideological economics in which many African countries, apart from South Africa, that industrialized under different conditions, are not part of the industrialized world. And that's what the climate justice conversation is about. It is thirdly a particular kind of security in which the hegemons secure the interest in those areas. And that's why France is seen in a particular way in Africa. And that's why EU politics is more, it's more complex. And actually, unfortunately for the EU, which looks like a really important bloc for all regions, then tends to lose out in terms of its image. And I therefore want to see a future in which we confront normatively what we do in other regions of the world, and lastly, in which we speak truth amongst ourselves, to say to African leaders, you are terrorizing your people where they are, and we will not do business with you on those terms. It will be on these terms. But also for all of us to truthfully say, you know, it's very hard to have these norms. And that's why the double standard. We're supporting this country because they're a friend, not because of the, you know, we're defending the norms. And we are opposing this country because they don't look like us, and then we're not friends. So honest diplomacy has to be part of the game of future justice, but also honest negotiation has to be part of future justice. Is the EU doing well in that area? It's doing far better than most, I think. It's the African leaders themselves, I would argue, that have done a disservice to their people because they do not show up at the table to really negotiate well on behalf of their people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Oliver, and then Stephen, and then we actually need to bring this conversation to an end, but it's been fascinating so far. Oliver.
Thank you. Well, there's so many issues that I would like to comment on that I'll have to be selective, unfortunately, but thank you so much for these fascinating comments. I'd just like to focus on two issues, particularly Ukraine, which I think is really an issue that reveals so much about global order, more broadly speaking. And I think that one of the reasons why in Latin America, which I haven't mentioned, there has been some sympathy or some support for Russia, which has created some tension between Latin America and Europe, is that we're living in very polarized times. And in Latin America, and particularly in Brazil, the far left and the far right both like the Putin regime for very different reasons. But I've actually had fascinating discussions interviewing the far left, who think of Russia as sort of the successor of the Soviet Union, but also think that Russia is the only one sort of standing up to the United States. So such anti-Americanism being the defining reason why there is support for Russia. And on the far right, and we've had a far right government over the past 4 years, there's tremendous admiration for the Putin regime because the Russian government says things like there's only 2 genders and there's no trans bathrooms in Russia. And, you know, there's a lot of admiration there from a sort of values point of view. And I think that one way to explain the support in the public debate for Russia, at least in Brazil, is to point to extreme polarization. It's if you're a far right blogger or far left blogger or YouTuber, you were probably quite sympathetic to Russia, and a lot of the narratives which were pushed by the Russian government about that Ukraine is actually a neo-Nazi regime were very visible in the debate in Latin America. So one of the most frequent questions I have received over the past 9 months is whether it's actually true that the West is supporting a neo-Nazi regime. And one of the websites which has been crucial to that is sort of Sputnik, which is very influential in Latin America. And that, I think, is an issue that remains more relevant than perhaps is perceived in Europe, that countries like Russia have been tremendously influential in the construction of narratives. When it comes to, I think, Europe's hypocrisy, well, yes, but also I think it's important to keep in mind that at least in Latin America, countries are embracing realpolitik sort of at its finest in a way, and saying, well, there's this war going on. It's certainly a violation of international law, but from a very strategic point of view, it just doesn't suit us to isolate Russia. And of course, there's accusations from all sides, that in Latin American countries say, well, why didn't Europe impose sanctions against the United States when they invaded Iraq? And why did nobody want to throw out the United States of the G20 at the time? Which, by the way, explains why Brazil was very resistant to Western pressure in 2014. When there was an attempt, or when there was a suggestion being made by the U.S. government for Brazil to disinvite Putin from the BRICS summit, which was taking place in Brazil at the time. He was also at the World Cup. So I think there's certainly hypocrisy in EU foreign policy, but there's also case-by-case analyses being made by countries in the global South. So I think that's not something unique to EU foreign policy. And just one issue, I think that two issues just to finish. The first is, in my interviews about this, what was really most fascinating is how little decision makers in the private sector, in civil society, and in politics in Brazil have an acute understanding of how the EU works. I include myself in this. So the discussions that I've had over the past years about the EU trade deal are above all confusing, because people don't understand how decision-making processes in Europe actually work. So now there's this big question, will this trade deal go ahead? Well, Brazil, I think, the Brazilian incoming government needs sort of some political victory to say, well, we kind of renegotiated this, but I think this doesn't have to be a major renegotiation. It's a bit like saying we just want to improve it a bit. But the question of, will the EU kind of accept that? How is that going to play out? That's very unclear, because the EU is at least from the outside, is so difficult to understand. And the final thing is, which I think is something to keep in mind, is the nationalist backlash against environmental pressure, against environmental shaming, is here to stay as well. Brazil is no longer the Bolsonaro Brazil, but the Lula government will have difficulties in implementing most of its environmental promises, because we have Bolsonaro leaning candidates or Bolsonarista allies in city halls, in state governments, in municipal assemblies, in the Senate, in Congress, and they will accuse the incoming government of being, doing the EU's work or facilitating the exploitation of European interests in the Amazon, etc. So I think it's really, really important to avoid that the environmentalist rhetoric can be utilized by nationalist forces, which has occurred frequently in the past, when the environmental concerns are often seen as a fig leaf for either geopolitical interest or as merely protectionism. And there's, I think, some fear. Two of the people I've interviewed were part of the team that negotiated the trade deal with the Europeans. And one of the major fears was that the EU was using its normative power to hide its protectionist instincts, to basically say, we can sign this trade deal, but then we say, unless you fulfill all these norms, you will not have access to the EU market. And I think that's certainly something which will continue to flare up occasionally as we discuss the future relationship between Latin America and the EU.
Stephen, would you like the final few words?
Well, I think my role is here to listen, right? Mm-hmm. So I'll limit myself really to 3 telegram sentences. I agree with the questioning of the concept of the global South. And Funmi also went a bit in that direction, because I wonder whether it really captures what is going on in the world today. And I think we heard a lot about the need to unpack it, and certainly the role of China. Where does China belong in this terminology? I was part of a conversation where Saudi Arabia said, we are part of the global South. That was news to me. Secondly, heard a lot about actions and living up to expectations, and I think that's very valid, and people constantly emphasize that with good reason. And then what we do, if in the EU, we go into the figures. We're the biggest source of climate finance. We're the part of the world where emissions are declining, where elsewhere it's growing. We're the biggest investor. We're the biggest trader. But again, I don't think that fully captures the phase of global politics in which we are, which is a lot about identity. And there are other factors, no matter how great your statistics are, there are other things that are not captured by that. And I think we don't have time for that today, but social media and everything else sort of plays into that. So that's the second point I wanted to make. And then finally, it's complicated. The EU is certainly complicated. There's an anecdote, and there was, an African diplomat who told me some countries make us offers that we cannot refuse. The EU makes us offers that we just don't understand. And that's certainly ongoing work. Back to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Stephen. On the Global South, we actually had a long footnote at some point on doing on all the research on the definitions, and it's, I suppose, for lack of a better definition. And there is a Global North and a Global South, and according to many, including in IMF, World Bank, etc., China should be in the Global North. I would like to bring this to an end. So first things, you're all invited to join us for lunch here. We have a light lunch. And then second thing, let me just thank our speakers online and Stephen and all of you for joining us today. It was great. We touched the tip of the iceberg, but I think it just shows how interesting this line of research is and how much more could be done. So thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Funmi, it was great meeting you, and I hope we can meet in person.
I look forward to meeting you. Thanks.
As this project continues, hopefully. Have a great day. Thank you.
Take care.